the port of Galle, on the south coast of Ceylon. Not the sort of place we usually start Struth episodes, and sadly we're not here to watch the cricket at one of the most picturesque stadiums in the world. It's 1877 and a mail steamer named China has come in from Melbourne. And on her manifest is a consignment of gold. 6 strong boxes full, banded and sealed, shipped out of Sydney for circulation amongst the colonies. The boxes are brought up from below and opened under strict supervision and a well-worn process. You open it, you count it, you sign for it. And 5 of those boxes are exactly as they should be. The 6th, however, is full of sawdust. Sawdust and a quantity of iron bolts that have been packed in to make up the weight. Where 5,000 freshly minted gold sovereigns should be, there is nothing but timber shavings and scrap metal. And they're sitting under a seal that looks, to the highly trained eye staring straight at it, as though it's been untouched. According to the records, the gold left the Sydney Mint. It was loaded, it was transferred, it was carried halfway across the world. But somewhere on that voyage, inside a locked strongroom, behind seals that nobody had broken, 5,000 gold sovereigns simply turned into iron bolts and sawdust. Welcome to Struth, the podcast where we go looking for the strangest, saddest and most stubborn mysteries in Australian history. Today we find ourselves back in South Gippsland, a place we can't seem to stray from for too long. And if you love a good Gippsland mystery, I'd strongly recommend checking out the Ghosts of Gippsland podcast. A big part of today's research comes directly from an episode that they did on this case. I'll link to it in the show notes. Specifically today, we're on the coast east of Inverloch, where a river called the Tarwin runs down through the scrub to the sea. It's quiet country, and it was quieter still in the 1870s. And for a few years, it was home to a softly spoken ship's carpenter who pulled off one of the most ingenious robberies in the colony's history. His name was Martin Weiberg, and this is the story of the Avoca gold. The Avoca was a steamer, a branch line vessel of the P&O Company, working the run between Sydney and Melbourne. In the winter of 1877, she carried, among the usual cargo and mail, a shipment of gold sovereigns that had been newly struck at the Sydney Mint. These were no ordinary coins, and the difference is worth exploring because it is the thread that eventually unravels everything in this tale. These particular sovereigns had been minted for circulation in Ceylon, the former name of the South Asian island, now officially known as Sri Lanka. And the patriotic folk there disliked the usual design, the very British image of St. George on horseback driving his spear into the dragon. And so this batch was struck with a different reverse, a simple wreath pattern. And as a result, there were not many like them in the world, and almost none in Victoria, because none of these coins had ever meant to go there. The plan to steal them was not a sudden thing. It had been laid down well in advance, and it began with a job that was entirely above board. At some point on the voyage, the ship's carpenter, a Norwegian fella named Martin Weiberg, was asked to repair the lock on the strongroom door. It was an ordinary request, but because there was gold behind that door, guards watched him while he worked. That was the precaution, and on the face of it, it was enough. A man can't rob a strongroom with 2 pairs of eyes on his hands the whole time. But as it transpires, these guards were watching the wrong thing. They had their eyes firmly fixed on the gold, while the foundations for the robbery were being laid right in front of them. While he worked away at the lock, slowly and carefully and exactly, just as a tradesman should, Weiberg was doing 2 jobs at once. He had the key in his hands the entire time, and somewhere in the course of that legitimate work, he pressed it into wax and took its shape. An impression he could carry away and cut a duplicate from at his leisure. And that was the first piece of his master plan, a key to the strongroom, quietly obtained, while the men charged with guarding it looked on and saw a carpenter doing carpentry. But a key is no use to a man who cannot get to the door unseen, and that door was watched around the clock. So the second task he was completing on that day was reconnaissance of the room itself. A ship is a complicated thing, full of spaces and gaps that exist for reasons of construction rather than access. And a ship's carpenter knows those spaces better than any man aboard. And Weiberg knew this vessel down to her bones. And a man kneeling in that strongroom with time to think had the leisure to study how it sat in the ship around it. And eventually he recognised a weakness, or perhaps an opportunity, depending on how you look at it. There was a hatch at the back of the deck, just large enough for a small man to get through, and from it a route to the strongroom along the keel of the ship itself. And so that was the second part of it, solved, and the 2 halves fitted together like a mortar and tennyson joint. The hatch would bring him to the strongroom without a soul seeing him go, and the key would open the door once he was there. And so, by the time the very ordinary repair was finished and the guards were satisfied, Martin Weiberg had quietly assembled everything he needed to walk into the most closely watched room on the ship and walk out again. And so, on the run down from Sydney, in the dark, he simply went in. As planned, he went down through the hatch and along the keel and came up at the strongroom out of sight of anyone. And he let himself in with his own cut key. It was rather primitive, but effective. And when he was in there, he lifted gold from just one of the boxes and then refilled the box carefully to weight with bolts and sawdust so that nobody handling it would notice the difference. The seals he dealt with last. He melted the wax onto the bands with a hot knife, lifted them, and set them back down again so neatly that the box looked exactly as it had when it left the mint. And then he simply locked the door behind him and went back the way he came. When the Avoca reached Melbourne, the boxes were transferred across to the ship named China for the long leg to Ceylon, and the men who carried them across noticed absolutely nothing. The weight was right, the seals were whole, and there was no reason on earth to think that one of those 6 boxes was now worth nothing at all. And so the robbery travelled on, undiscovered all the way to Galle, further and further away from Weiberg, where they were finally opened up and the sawdust was found. But getting the gold out of the box was just the beginning. It only moved the gold from inside a locked box to somewhere else on a working steamer in the middle of the ocean. It did not get it ashore. And getting it ashore was a far heavier problem in the most literal sense, because 5,000 gold sovereigns weigh the better part of 40 kilograms, and that is not a sum a man folds into his coat and carries quietly down a gangway. So how did Weiberg get it off the ship? The truth is, we don't know how he managed it. Nobody ever proved it. So perhaps the most ingenious part of the whole robbery is the part that we can't see at all. We know the gold left the box, but in the stretch of time after that, the actual moving of a fortune in heavy metal off a moving ship and onto a dark coast was done so cleanly that more than a century later, it is still a blank. Whatever Martin Weiberg arranged out there in the water, he arranged it well enough that it has never been undone. And so we simply have to pick up the story a chapter later. A man on shore, a man who has ditched his life at sea, a man who, at this point of time at least, has won. He has a new life waiting for him, bought and paid for in someone else's gold. What we do know is after Weiberg had quit the Avoca, he married a Melbourne woman named Rosina and taken up a selection of land on the Tarwin River, near Inverloch in South Gippsland. 120 acres to be exact, a small cottage and a young daughter. And to his neighbours, he was a quiet, capable man who had given up the ships to try his hand at farming, which was an ordinary enough story in that country at that time. He was also, quietly, very rich. He paid for things in gold, which was an unusual trait amongst farmers. He did his best to live modestly, but he and his family were never short. A careful eye might have noticed that a man who had thrown in his ship's wages for 120 acres of Gippsland scrub never seemed to want for a sovereign. But the timing of all of this ran entirely in Weiberg's favour, because in 1878, the colony of Victoria had something much louder to occupy it. This, of course, was the height of the Galle outbreak. At Stringy Bark Creek, Ned Kelly and his gang shot dead 3 policemen, and from that moment the full weight of the colony's police and the colony's newspapers swung north and east and went looking for the Galle gang. A robbery at sea, months old, with no body and no obvious victim, and a culprit nobody had identified, sat well down on the page. One of the men who later chased Weiberg's gold put it plainly. The carpenter was tucked away on page 3 or 4, while Ned Kelly held the front. And so, for a while, it really did look as though Martin Weiberg had done the impossible. He'd managed to steal a fortune in gold from a locked room on a moving ship, walked away clean, and settled down to spend it in the quiet, in a part of the country where nobody was looking. But he did make one mistake. He had started to spend a little too freely. Sovereigns with wreath patterns began to turn up in Victoria. They were unmistakable to anyone who knew coin because they were simply not supposed to be there at all. These were Ceylon coins, 1877 Sydney mintage, and here they were changing hands in Melbourne and, of all places, in South Gippsland. A detective with a good memory and a sense for these things would only need to ask one question. Where is this gold coming from? But the thing that is supposed to have pointed the finger at Weiberg first was not a clever city detective. It was a bar of soap. A cake of soap, of course, can be made around almost anything. Sovereigns set into the middle of a bar. The bar finished smooth over the top. One of the girls working for him cut open one of those bars until the knife stopped against something that should not have been in a cake of soap. Sovereigns, gold ones. How that discovery travelled from the kitchen to the police is something else that we don't know, but we can assume. The likeliest path is the simplest one, that the girl simply let slip. That a thing like a bar of soap full of gold does not stay quiet in a household or a district for long, and that word of it eventually reached the ears of men who had been wondering for months where those wreath sovereigns in South Gippsland were coming from. And however it got out, it got out. And that is what is said to have first turned suspicion toward Martin Weiberg. And so 2 detectives come down to Gippsland in the early part of 1879, carefully. They don't announce themselves as police. They dress instead as selectors, men down from town looking at land. Because the man they are hunting is, by every account, a very clever one. And a clever man who sees the law coming has time to make himself scarce, or worse, has time to move what he has hidden. And so the detectives take their time. They intend to come at him sideways, to be at his door before he knows there is reason to be watching the road. And they're still on the track up from the Tarwin, still working out how they will play it, when a man comes riding down toward them. And as they give this rider a friendly nod, as he comes level with them, this quiet, capable-looking man on a horse, they simply can't believe their luck. They won't need to find his hut. They won't have to knock on a door and talk their way past a suspicious wife. Because the first man they have met on the road, the man drawing level with them right now, is Martin Weiberg. And so they stop him. Interestingly, he does not run, which a guilty man might, and he does not kick up a fuss. He sits on his horse, and he lets them search him. And the 2 detectives go through his pockets and his purse, and in that purse they find it. 40 gold sovereigns. One of the detectives takes a coin and turns it in his fingers and sees the wreath on the back of it, the pattern struck in Sydney for a colony on the far side of the Indian Ocean, the pattern that has no business at all being in a purse on a bush track in South Gippsland. And the detective simply says, "These look very much like the sovereigns taken from the Avoca." It is the kind of line that ought to land like a trap closing. A guilty man caught cold with the stolen gold in his hand might deny it. He might claim he won it at cards or was paid by a stranger. He might at the very least go pale and quiet. But not our man Weiberg. He does none of that. Instead, he replies like a man quite used to outsmarting people. "Yeah," he says, "that's some of them." And that's all. No alarm, no scramble for a story, just a man on a horse agreeing, almost agreeably, that the gold the whole colony has been hunting for 2 years is sitting in his purse, and that there is rather more of it where that came from. After Weiberg is taken to the lockup, the detectives return to his hut. And the gold was everywhere, and not in the places you'd first think to look. There was a carpenter's plane, a simple tool that had been bored out and packed with sovereigns and plugged again so neatly that the only thing wrong with it was that it weighed far too much. There were more coins in a drum of tallow, and more still in cakes of homemade soap, hidden in the seat of a chair, buried under the hearth in a great cake of beeswax. The hut was simply dripping with gold. And these were just some of his plans. That was his word for it. To plant something was to hide it, to put it down in the ground or the bush or the fabric of a house, and walk away knowing you could come back. And Weiberg had plants all over his selection, and as it would turn out, all over that stretch of coast. So the detectives took what they could find, and they would spend a long time bemoaning the fact that most of it was simply still missing. Weiberg was tried, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labour, but the gold was the thing now. The missing thousands of it, and the authorities thought they had found a way to get it back, because Weiberg had offered them a deal. He told them he had sunk a kettle packed with somewhere near 1,700 sovereigns in the Tarwin River. But, he added, he could not describe the spot well enough for them to find it on their own. He would have to take them there himself, and so they took him back to the Tarwin. It's early morning on the river. In a small rowing boat are Weiberg, his 2 police escorts and a local boatman who knows these waterways. Weiberg is not handcuffed because he's being helpful, because he has been nothing but helpful, and a man surely can't be expected to point out a hiding place on a riverbank with his wrists chained together. And they work their way up the wild reaches of the Tarwin to the place he describes, where the bank rises steep out of the water, and he points. In there, he says, under the roots of that gum. And every eye in the boat goes to the spot on the bank where he is pointing. And Weiberg seizes his moment. He strikes hard, a blow to the pit of the detective's stomach that doubles the man up. And he's over the side and upsetting the boat as he goes. And the other men lose their balance too in the commotion and are suddenly in the water and clinging to an upturned hull. At least one of the men can't swim, which causes even more chaos. And Martin Weiberg, who is powerful and fast and ready, is already gone. Up the steep bank and into the thick scrub, where a boat full of soaked policemen has no hope of following him. He stayed gone for 5 months. He lived rough in the country around Anderson's Inlet, and he was not alone. There were kangaroo hunters camped through that scrub, hard men living off the land, and Weiberg moved among them. They harboured him, partly, the record suggests, because his story dazzled them. The amazing tale of a ship's carpenter who had robbed a P&O liner and slipped the police twice, and partly for the much simpler reason that he could pay, because whatever else Weiberg was short of out there, it was never short of a wreath coin. But he couldn't live like this forever, and so he made a plan to get away for good. He gave a quantity of gold, something like £1,000 worth, to one of his bush acquaintances, a man who was to go up to Melbourne and buy and provision a small boat. The plan was sound, but the man he entrusted it to was not. He bungled the job, loaned some of the money away, was robbed of more of it by people much sharper than himself, and before long both he and most of the gold were in the hands of the police. And the other problem that Weiberg had was the swimming. It turned out he was an exceptional swimmer, and he used that skill to his advantage for some time. He crossed the sands of the inlet only on a rising tide, so that the water would come in behind him and take his footprints before anyone could read them. And he would swim Anderson's Inlet itself, better than a mile of cold, open water that was known in summer to hold sharks, because the crossing took him where the police on horseback could not quickly go. And while it helped him escape time and time again, it was that habit that finally undid him. The detectives slowly worked out that their man was swimming the inlet, and they rowed round to the far shore, to Cape Patterson, and they watched the water, and they waited. And on one glorious afternoon they saw him, out in the inlet swimming across. Just as he came up on the shore he saw them, and he ran back for the relative safety of the water. Shots were fired, and one of them struck in the sea just in front of him. Martin Weiberg, thinking better of it, threw his hands up in defeat. And this time the coppers held him, and he served out his remaining sentence. After serving his time, Weiberg came out of prison and with his brother bought a small yacht. Some accounts called the yacht Neva. And in 1883 the two of them sailed her down to the Glennies, a scatter of islands off Walkerville on that same stretch of South Gippsland coast. Rosina, his wife, was living at Walkerville by then. The marriage had not survived the years of jail and flight, and she was working as a housekeeper for a local family, with the younger of their children by her side. Weiberg left his brother with the boat sheltering near the islands, and he rowed a small tender into shore. He had been drinking, and the weather was turning, and it was generally assumed then and since that he had not come ashore just to see Rosina, that somewhere on that coast there was one more plant, one more cache of wreath gold, the gold the police were never able to find, the last of the gold that he wanted to lift before he went, for good. He asked Rosina to come away with him, but she refused. She had put this life of drama, for better and for worse, behind her. And so he went back to the tiny rowboat alone, to row out to the Neva. And by now the sea had got up badly, and people on the shore watched him go. The waves were running high, and the whitecaps were breaking over the bow of the little boat as he pulled out into them. A day or two later, the rowboat washed up on Yanaki Beach. With it was an oilskin coat that the locals knew was Weiberg's. But of Weiberg himself there was no sign at all. The general view was that he'd drowned, that the little rowboat had gone over in the squall, and the cold and the dark had taken him, and that he had gone down, weighed perhaps by the very sovereigns he had rowed ashore to collect, sitting heavy in the pockets of a drowning man. His body was never found. And this is where the record runs out, and the stories begin. And I want to mark that line clearly, because everything up to here rests on newspapers and court records, and everything after it is powered by the local rumour mill. The trouble started straight away with the brother. He would not believe that Weiberg had drowned, and a good many locals were inclined to agree with him. Lights and fires were reported on the Glenny Islands, which were uninhabited and had no business showing lights at all. A steamer captain even went out and searched the islands and reported that he found nothing. But the story was already loose, that the drowning was a performance, that the rowboat and his oilskin coat were left out to be found, and that Weiberg was out there on the islands, or perhaps by now even past them, with as much gold as he could carry. He knew that he would never be a free man in South Gippsland, that the police would be all over him, especially if the rumours were true, and that there was more gold to be spent. And so within months the rumour had him alive and very much gone. In December of 1883 it was published that Weiberg had never drowned at all, that he had boarded a steamer called the Sorata and was on his way to London, and from London the story travelled on by itself. He had settled in Sweden, some said, and owned a large hotel there. The ship's carpenter from Gippsland, grown respectable and rich on Ceylon's gold. There was a stranger version still. Years later, a Victorian man travelling in the south of France stopped at a small village inn in Provence and got talking with the host, and was startled to learn that the innkeeper had a brother in Victoria, a brother who knew Inverloch, who had told him all about a famous gold robbery there. The villagers called the innkeeper André Devane. They thought him a mysterious sort. He had turned up about 5 years before and never spoke of his earlier life. And the brother he spoke of? The brother who knew that stretch of Gippsland coast so well? He had told him that the police there were fools, that they had searched the hut when they should have searched the ground around it. And then there was the skeleton. In the 1890s, a man digging at Waratah Bay turned up human remains. A complete skeleton, but for a piece missing from the back of the skull. The general opinion at the time was that this was Weiberg, that he had never left the coast at all. But if it was him, then surely he didn't drown, because a man that has lost a piece of the back of his own skull wasn't a drowning victim. If those were his bones, then somewhere out there was the person who put them into the ground, and the questions stop being, where did the gold go, and become something quite a bit darker. And so, dear listener, here is where you get to take your choice. Maybe he drowned in the squall off Walkerville with the gold in his pockets. Maybe he faked the whole thing and ran for Europe and grew old behind a bar in Provence or a hotel in Sweden. Or perhaps he came back for one more plant and met someone on that coast who wanted it more than he did. The record doesn't choose between those outcomes, and neither will I. What the record does say is this: of the 5,000 sovereigns that left the Sydney Mint, fewer than 2,000 were ever accounted for. Some came out of the carpenter's plane and the tallow drum and the soap. Some were taken off the bush accomplice in South Melbourne. In 1904, a farmer near Inverloch, chopping up an old tree for firewood, split it open and found 75 gold sovereigns inside. A plant that Weiberg had made and never come back for. All told, somewhere over 3,000 sovereigns have never been accounted for. They're still missing. Maybe they were spent in Sweden, or maybe they went down off Yanaki Beach, or maybe they're in the ground right now, somewhere along the Tarwin, or under the sand at Eagle's Nest, in a kettle or a tin, or the hollow of a tree, exactly where a careful man put them 140 years ago. But this isn't over, my friends. There is one last twist in this tale, and it brings long-time listeners of Struth back to familiar, albeit swampy, ground. One of the things that I learnt during the research for this episode related to Weiberg's selection. His 120 acres on the Tarwin was eventually passed to the Clement family. They took in a stretch of that country, reclaimed wetland on the Tarwin Flats, and built it into a grand property they called Tullaree. And for a time the Clements flourished there. They became extraordinarily wealthy, and they entertained on a scale that Gippslanders had never seen and have never seen since. Parties at Tullaree drew the Melbourne society of the day out into the wilds of South Gippsland. The whole glittering set of them. And then, the way these things go, the family began to thin. Deaths came, and the running of the place fell to the two remaining Clements, Jeannie and Margaret. And quite simply, they were not equal to it, and it's hard to see how they could have been. Jeannie and Margaret had spent their formative years abroad, travelling, dancing, moving through the same society that had once come to their parties. And nobody had ever taught them how to run an enormous farm, because nobody had imagined that they would need to. The management folded, the income dwindled, and the swampy ground that the family had once pushed back began, slowly, and then not so slowly, to take the Tarwin Flats again, until in the end it closed all around the grand house at Tullaree itself. And it was on that swampy ground, in the water around that failing house, that the last of the Clements disappeared, mysteriously, in 1952. Margaret Clement, the Lady of the Swamp, as the papers came to call her, she was, of course, the first story we ever told here on Struth. Episode 1. And standing here, at the end of Weiberg's story, I cannot help but wonder whether it is only coincidence. Because let's think about what the Clements did with that land. Wealth that appeared, and appeared in abundance, and was spent in ways that stagger the people who remember it. Spending that turned out to have no flaw under it at all. And I find myself asking a question I can't answer. Was the Clement fortune built only on the ordinary things, on luck and land and a good head for money? Or was there something already in that ground that supported their rise to riches? Struth. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Struth. As I mentioned, a big part of the research today was taken from the fantastic Ghosts of Gippsland podcast. Make sure you check it out. At the risk of sounding a bit like a broken record, I just want to thank you all. Your support for the show, again, over the last couple of weeks has been nothing short of phenomenal. New people are finding the show all the time, and I can only assume it's because of you wonderful listeners, telling a friend, putting it on your socials. It all makes a huge difference to me, and I really appreciate it. So if you haven't done so already, come and join us on Instagram, Facebook, or if you want even more Struth Premium, which is now available on not only Patreon, but Apple Podcasts as well. I'll leave links to all of those things in the show notes. Uru.